I don't know. I think a significant challenge in thinking about these events is you have to maintain two aspects of the mentality of the Oved Hashem simultaneously, one of which is to look at what's happening and to see it through the lens of Torah and be able to critique it. And when you do that, it can be very frustrating because there's a very big gap between what's being done by leaders right now in actuality and what you might think they should do if they were taking more guidance from the Torah. And that feels um, like, watching a calamity happen in slow motion. Uh, and that can be very painful because you feel like, oh, well, if you're not going to do it right, then it's not going to turn out well. And yet, I think at the same time, what we also have to appreciate is that it's always been the case that we haven't measured up as far as Kadosh Baruch Hu is concerned. Like we're the idea of our doing as a nation as a whole, everything exactly as we should be doing. That's never actually what's happening. And Kadosh Baruch Hu has great rachamim and great patience and helps us along. And viewed in those terms, I think there's great zchut in the nation, and a lot of merit on the part of many people in many different sectors of society in different ways, um, according to the standards of Torah. And in many ways, I think the society has moved a lot in the right direction on many scores since its founding. And if we merited Nisim in 48 and 67, Kal v'chomer that now HaKadosh Baruch Hu can still be with us. And yes, he lets us suffer terrible setbacks. And that's a way for him to rebuke the nation for all the different mistakes the different pieces of the society have made. But that doesn't mean then he abandons us and now we're on our own. And I don't have the feeling right now that the point now is for us to just fall further and sink deeper and be further tormented because of the insufficiency of our approach as a nation as a whole to our problems, and that we're not perfectly and fully in line with what Hashem wants or what the Torah commands us. We've been rebuked quite savagely already, and there's hopefully enough of a turn to Hashem happening, and also hopefully enough merit amongst us that we also can expect that, now that we've been dealt the lesson, that we can be given some comfort and some help when we cry to him, which many of us are doing. I mean, I think one of the things that I was referencing that is a very difficult subject, and this is something that Rabbi Grossman has brought up, which is important, is that when things happen that are clearly calamitous and terrible for the nation, it's a very hard instinct now for everyone to have to think of it in terms of tshuva in a way that's in any way specific, meaning that it's part of the ethos of the kind of society, especially the kind of modern Western liberal society, that when bad things happen to countries, the discourse is always in terms of the accountabilities of the leaders and whose fault is it. And there's something productive about that because it does help voters sometimes to boot out bad leaders and maybe choose better ones, theoretically, and sometimes in practice. And there is a need to examine things from that perspective and solve problems by analyzing them and trying to fix them. But it's also true that when calamitous things happen at some level, it's also because HaKadosh Baruch Hu let them happen to us, and he did that to send us a message that's more about, the cheshbon nefesh and the taking a look at how we're doing things, and whether it's really right in his eyes, so that it's not just about the pragmatic analysis, but it's also about whether we're aligning our priorities with Hashem's priorities. And I think one of the things that gives that way of looking at things a bad rap is that sometimes when people talk in that voice, they're being very simplistic in a way that kind of makes a joke out of it, where it's that somehow the answer is always there's too much lashon hara or not enough kashrut or whatever it is, and no matter what terrible thing happens anywhere, it's always kind of, oh, this must be divine punishment because we aren't doing these things that we're always talking about how we need to do better. And also it's this sort of one size fits all thing where when terrible things happen, it must be kind of like the result of one sin or whatever. Whereas in fact, I think that talking mechanistically about divine wrath is a huge mistake. And really, we get that from our tradition. Like if you read Sefer Iyov, for example, the point is not to go to someone who's suffering and say, this was caused by your sin. The point is more that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu puts us in a state of feeling punished by the events that have befallen us, then we are open to wanting to change ourselves and our situation. And we have to use that opportunity to transform ourselves and our society. And the point is that when you view it from that perspective, it's different transformations that are needed in different sectors or in different individuals, right? So each individual has the questions he or she should be asking about how to change. And also, you can look at the nation as a whole, because especially this was calamity that affected the whole nation. And it's not the case that there's somehow one thing that the whole nation did. Like, oh, we didn't have, you can kind of tell that if you try to make that kind of argument, the one size fits all constraint makes it not expressive enough to really cover all the potential issues. Because like we have to point to one thing the whole nation wasn't doing. It always ends up being like, oh, look, we were so riven, we didn't have enough unity, and now we've been punished for not having enough unity, and now we need more unity. There may be some truth to that, but unity for its own sake, without it being unity in commitment to doing what's right, and learning that from HaKadosh Baruch Hu through his Torah, may not be worth enough to be the whole story. And I think that if you look, you go around through different groups within society, it may be that there are totally different issues that you could say this was a calamity for all of us, but it wasn't equally a calamity in a way that should spur us to the same kinds of changes. Because for some sectors of society, it may be that they were indifferent to the plight of Jews living in the South who've been putting up with the constant, intermittent, or constant over a long time scale and intermittent on shorter time scales violence from Gaza, and just treating it like it's a weather system that inhabits the southern regions and we can't do anything about it, and then turning away and dealing with something else. Maybe a lot of the country should be asking whether it was okay that we let that persist, and that we weren't all up in arms about how we have to do something about this. It also is interesting that our enemies named their attack after their name for their symbolic structure on Har HaBayit, because by doing so, they showed how important it is to them to prevent us from having sovereignty on Har HaBayit and from doing what Hashem wants us to do there. And there are a lot of Jews who agree with our enemies about that Jews shouldn't be doing anything there, and that we shouldn't even set foot there. And maybe also this is a wake-up call that is a mistake being made by many Jews who show great commitment in some respects to doing what Hashem wants, but when it comes to that stuff, perhaps need to reflect on whether they really have the right priorities. And you can go down through a lot of different versions of looking at, who are we, and what are the things we're doing right, and what are the things that we're getting wrong. And that question will be different for different groups in society. And the idea of national tshuva should be that we all are asking ourselves those questions and finding fault in ourselves as individuals, but also, thinking about the hard changes that we aren't usually willing to consider because we're shocked, and we have to treat the shock as the opportunity to be open to possibilities we weren't willing to consider. And that goes for every way you slice it. It goes for Dati Leomi, it goes for Haredi, it goes for Chiloni, it goes for people in the Merkaz, it goes for people in Yehudan Shevron, it goes for people in the South, it in the kibbutzim, whatever, all the different ways you can slice up society. It doesn't need to be that there's one reason that something like this happens, but it's more that we all, as individuals and as groups, need to be seeking those reasons and doing it with the sincerity that will allow us to come face to face with considering changes that we only have the strength to consider when we're so broken by an event of this magnitude, that we're finally willing to really ask, what am I getting wrong that I usually am not willing to consider, because something is gravely wrong. And I think if enough of us ask that question in enough different ways, then, and it's not necessarily the job of everyone to going around pointing the finger at everyone else too willingly. But if everyone asks that question enough, I think we'll find a lot of answers. We'll go through a lot of tshuva of different kinds in different sectors, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu will see that, and Be'ezrato, we can turn this calamity into an opportunity for great progress. I think on the one hand, it's not productive for people to kind of just think about what is it that all these other people must have done, that is the reason that we're in this situation. Obviously, though, part of the discussion needs to be of that kind, because clearly some of what happens is partly the result of mistakes others are making, and there is a mitzvah of rebuking others who are making a mistake, or committing a transgression or whatever. And so the point is not to remain silent and refuse to acknowledge problems in the behaviors of others. That's not what we learn from the Torah, right? Part of Ve'ahavta l're'echa kamocha, of loving your neighbor as yourself, actually is not hating your neighbor in your heart, but rather, rebuking him so that he can do better. We learn that from the Torah. What I'm trying to resist is the idea that the way calamity at an individual or national level works is that when bad things happen, that mechanistically there's like one sin, which is the cause, and then the billiard balls all bounce around, and then the punishment happens. I don't see that notion being supported very strongly in our tradition, but rather I think that the point is that when calamity occurs, the opportunity for tshuva allows one with the perspective to understand, to connect the dots and make connections, and sort of give meaning to the calamity by recognizing it in the context of the mistakes that one now has the motivation to fix. So it doesn't make sense to go back and say like, oh, you're the one who set the billiard ball in motion because, of this sin. And then go around and point at others and try to find, who set it rolling. Of course, when something like this happens, it's all of us individually and many different sectors in society. And once you recognize that, I think that there are a lot of different ways we can reflect about ourselves and whatever sectors we see ourselves as belonging to, and also others. And it's okay to, mention more than one and to not blind oneself to it. Like, I mentioned before, there are a bunch of people in the society who think that Jews don't have any business being on the Temple Mount. And I note that our enemies constantly brand their greatest assault against us with their name for their symbolic conquest of the Temple Mount. And maybe those two things are more than a little bit connected, whether you look at it providentially or if you look at it even just politically and mechanistically in those terms. So whether we're talking about Haredi resistance to going to Har HaBayit, or whether we're talking about sort of more secular left-wing resistance to going to Har HaBayit, I think everyone there should be asking themselves, is that really going to continue to be, the line that we propound in this situation? But the point is that that the fact that we found one thing that makes sense doesn't preclude the possibility that now we have to kind of turn the kaleidoscope and look at it from a different perspective. So, and there are other things that people, will point out where they want to say, oh, well, right before this happened, we had people, bursting into prayer on, the streets of Tel Aviv on Yom Kippurim and disrupting it with this sinat chinam and this hatred of Yahadut and Torah, and, open expression of that hatred. And look what it did. And for sure, fine. I'm willing to say that that also is something that was repugnant and, very bad behavior on the part of some of the nation. And really it represented the culmination of a lot more bad behavior from a much larger segment of the population that was whipping everyone into a frenzy for the better part of a year about how, Torah and Judaism are this negative force that's taking over the society. So we have to put on billboards, chofshi mikfiyat datit, chofshi migizanut, which are these, dog whistles for, oh, well, we all know that, Torah and Judaism are coercive and racist. And so, we want to live in a society that's free from those things. And it was all aimed at, whipping up mass aversion to the Judaic character of the state and society on the part of a significant sector that was, lawlessly trying to coerce others with disruption and threat of further disruption for the better part of a year. So, yeah, I think that is something that people need to look in the mirror about. But the point is that the fact that we could start there, doesn't mean we can't just keep going around and say, okay, well, what about all the people who, maybe have prided themselves on, being, very right wing and very, concerned about sovereignty and very concerned about the Jewishness of the state and very interested in the Torah. But, really, if Jews are one responsible for the other, why was it the case that for the better part of 20 years, you had people living in the South that just had rockets falling on them every other day? And it wasn't the case that the Jews who were living elsewhere weren't just like chaining themselves to the doors of the Knesset over that, because at some level, that should never have been acceptable, right? And ultimately, the demand to eliminate Hamas was weak enough, coming from enough of the society, that quote unquote right-wing governments could be elected for decades and maybe promise to do something about it and then not do anything about it and then kind of get away with it because people had other priorities. So, the complacency and the willingness to kind of become anesthetized and accustomed to not eliminating Amalek and just letting it go on and fester, that became a modus operandi for a large sector of the society. And of course, people had their other concerns and their other very legitimate concerns. You had a lot of people who were getting, attacked and killed in Yehuda and Shomron, and you can forgive them for caring about the fact that could happen, on their way to work, more than about what's going on in a different part of the country. But I'm just saying, like, there's a million reasons, in a sense, that you could say many of us, many subsets of the nation as a whole, are at fault to one degree or another for engaging in behaviors before this happened that we now need to be asking, like, what can I do differently going forward? And again, I don't think that's because we should look at it in terms of these are the mechanistic processes that led to HaKadosh Baruch Hu striking us with his fist, but rather that when he strikes us with his fist, we have to get up and we have to ask ourselves, what can we change? Because what he's done by hitting us is given us the motivation to change a lot of things. And now we have to take stock in the right way of all the things that we can change at an individual level, at the level of communities, at the level of the whole nation. And it can be everything from, everyone's complacency about and comfort with Oslo, everyone's complacency and comfort about the travesty of lack of sovereignty and defilement that we have as status quo on the Temple Mount, and also the division of the nation and everything else. But you can make a long list, and the more of us think seriously both about ourselves and about understanding how to help others, make that same accounting, the better chance we have of HaKadosh Baruch Hu really thinking a lot of what we've come up with and giving us all the help we need and more.